Throughout these past 5 years, we've often turned to Heba Morayef for a sober reading as impassioned events unfolded. Heba, thanks for joining us from Cairo.
It's nice to be with you again, François.
You're Associate Director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. First of all, how strong has the crackdown been in the build-up to January the 25th?
Unexpectedly strong, disproportionately, I would also say, because it's not like those groups who would usually mobilize for street activists, for street protests, were calling for any this time around. The cost of street protests is incredibly high, not just in terms of the imprisonment with no likelihood of release, but also the potential for being shot by live ammunition. So in a sense, the arrests, the raids of downtown apartments, also the raids of cultural institutes in downtown Cairo, all of that seemed to indicate a level of panic that was quite unjustified in terms of the expectations for the number of protesters.
What does that tell you?
I think it says that the regime hasn't forgotten what January 25th means. I think that in and of itself was a very traumatic moment for Egypt's police state, for the security services who had always reigned supreme and never expected to see a day like that. And I don't think they've forgotten the experience of that day. So for the moment, they feel or have felt so far for the last couple of years that they are completely in control, that they've annihilated the opposition, that they've taken a zero-tolerance approach to any forms of dissent, shut down protests, imprisoned critical journalists. And yet even all of that is not enough to really wipe out the memory of what January 25th means. So I think this nervousness is a sign that they know that they have a much bigger problem on their hands than one that they can address just through fear and propaganda.
Is remembering January the 25th something that happens in a Cairo bubble, or is it the whole country?
So I think perhaps the nostalgia for January 25th is a bit of a Cairo and Alexandria, Suez bubble. I mean, those were the cities who were really in the vanguard of the protests early that year. For the rest of the country, sentiments are mixed because, of course, many people who participated in the January Uprising were doing so because they had very clear demands for social justice. They had socioeconomic demands, and they wanted an end to corruption and the massive income gap in Egypt. Now, I don't think those demands have gone away, and I don't think the criticism of the government's performance on the economy has gone away either, but that doesn't necessarily translate into nostalgia for protests for people who have suffered economically, since those protests actually led to a deterioration in the economic situation. But the distaste for corruption or that awareness of an income gap hasn't gone away either.
Hasn't gone away. What are, at your organization, the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, what's your relationship like with authorities? Because we've seen, for instance, just last week, one German NGO saying, we're leaving because every time we want to try to organize some kind of symposium, we're shut down.
Well, over the last 2 years, the vast majority of international organizations working on human rights or any form of political advocacy have actually left the country. For those that remain, the independent Egyptian human rights organizations, we operate in a very difficult climate. The regime has at various moments threatened to prosecute and shut down human rights organizations. They haven't done so far, but at least 3 of the independent human rights organizations are currently facing investigation. So it's a rather tenuous situation. If you look at the rest of civil society, a number of independent journalists are imprisoned. A number of the more progressive political parties have also faced restrictions. So in a sense, that space that remains a very vulnerable one.
The old expression is, revolution is like Saturn, it devours its own children. In this case, though, did the revolution devour its own children?
Well, when you think back to a lot of the most famous faces of those protests, many of them are today behind bars or some in exile. Those have managed to get out. And so in that sense, you can see that there is no intention on the part of the regime for today, at least, to scale down the crackdown or to loosen its grip somewhat in the way that the Mubarak regime did in its last decade. I think it's very difficult for the generation of activists who took part in the protests to deal with this moment. Today is a depressing day. When one thinks back to that level of empowerment, I think that younger people felt in early January 2011. So I guess the only caveat that I would mention at this point is that history doesn't stop at a certain point. We may today be in an objectively worse position than where we were before the uprising. But the future is still very unknown because this is still a rapidly evolving situation.
Heba Morayef, one final question for you. The France 24 debate came and you participated in our show in 2013 after the first civilian president had been overthrown, but before a bloody crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood. At the point, there seemed to be this sort of feeling that we were witnessing a slow-motion car crash. Could it all have been avoided?
I think many things could have been avoided, including August 14th, which was the day of the big massacre. I think in the aftermath of the massacre, a certain path was taken from which it was difficult to then rewind. But there were moments in the lead up to the massacre where I think decision-making could have gone in different directions had different political forces aligned themselves differently. I don't think there's anything that is inevitable about the past 5 years. I also think that that the Muslim Brotherhood also had a number of choices during their period in time which wouldn't have necessarily made it that easy for the old regime actors to build up to the overthrow of Morsi. I also think that there were various moments in 2011 where different choices could have been made. In a sense, I don't think that today we can say that the January 2011 uprising was doomed to failure. And I also don't think today we can say that in 10 or 15 years from now, we will look back on that moment and say that that was a terrible mistake. There's too much unpredictability in the time ahead. I don't think people who experience that kind of empowerment, in particular the younger generation, people whose awareness of politics in Egypt came into being at that moment where Mubarak was overthrown. That is a very different generation from my generation, which knew mostly only Mubarak. So I'd say, don't give up on Egypt and keep watching this space.
Heba Morayef, we will indeed. Heba Morayef of the Egypt. Thank you for joining us from the Egypt Initiative for Personal Rights.